Legislative Conference. Our next session features 3 representatives from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Ron Eidshaug is the Vice President of the U.S. Chamber's Congressional and Public Affairs Division. He has held a variety of positions since joining the Chamber in 1999. As a sought-after speaker, he has presented for governors, senators, members of Congress, administration officials, and business leaders across the country as well as internationally. He also works as the Chamber's chief lobbyist on environmental, energy, and regulatory reform issues. Today, he will share federal updates with us. Matt Webb works as the Senior Vice President for Legal Reform Policy at the U.S. Chamber Institute for Legal Reform. In this role, he oversees the development and advocacy of ILR's position and policy on key federal legal reform issues. Before joining ILR, he worked as Research Director for Safe Streets, a not-for-profit foundation focusing on criminal justice reform. During this session, he will discuss liability. And finally, Caroline Harris, who will be joining us shortly, directs the development, promotion, and publication of the Chamber's policy on tax-related matters as the Vice President of Tax Policy and Economic Development and as Chief Tax Policy Counsel. In this role, she works with other Chamber policy centers to advance policies that improve economic growth. She routinely meets with members of Congress and their staffs, administration, and regulatory agencies to promote the Chamber's tax policy. She frequently speaks to business leaders, local Chamber of Commerce, other trade associations, and member companies to educate them on the Chamber's tax policy priorities, the current legislative outlook, and other pro-growth initiatives. So today she'll cover tax policy. Thank you all for joining us to share your expertise. We ask that you hold your questions until the end and we will get to those. And I'm going to toss it over to Ron.
Good morning, Liz. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. It's great to be with you. So it's tough to give a congressional outlook presentation a week before the election. There's so many unknowns out there. So rather than having a neat and tidy presentation, I'm coming to you from my messy basement with some thoughts and reflections on where we're at now and what we need to look at going forward. So I think the biggest thing on the congressional calendar is really what's going to happen with the next phase of coronavirus relief legislation. And where are we at? Congress has passed 3 or 3.5 phases of relief, but they have not gotten something over the finish line since earlier in the spring. And the phase 3 bill is the one that created the Paycheck Protection Program, the EIDL loan program, a lot of assistance for small businesses and other businesses. And then there was the phase 3.5 bill, which plussed up those funds after the PPP program ran dry. Since that time, there's been a lot of talk about what the next phase of legislation should look like. The pandemic has gone on for much, much longer than I think that Congress initially anticipated back when everybody was still trying to figure out what PPP meant. The House actually passed some legislation in the beginning of the summer. The Senate has talked about passing some legislation, and there's been some ideas out there, but they haven't had legislation on the floor. And over the last several weeks, we've heard that Nancy Pelosi and Treasury Secretary Mnuchin have been going back and forth negotiating on what a new package would look like. And then you hear the president talking about go big or go home, get something done. And then you hear, particularly yesterday, that the legislation is going to have to wait until after the election. So there's a couple of reasons for that. I think that there's some broad agreement on what the areas of importance are, things that should be included in that legislation. And, I'll just sort of go through some of them quickly. Sort of the biggest one is probably the PPP program and upping that program, reauthorizing that program. That program has expired, and making sure that businesses can continue to receive assistance as the pandemic has endured, dealing with loan forgiveness under the program. It's funny, just before the presentation, I was looking through the news clips, and there was an article about how difficult it is for forgiveness under the PPP program. Many businesses are experiencing a hard time when Congress created a program that was supposed to be very, very easy for loan forgiveness. So dealing with those kinds of things, expanding eligibility, expanding the kinds of programs, changing some of the requirements, expanding the PPP program to chambers of commerce. Local chambers of commerce across the country are among the very, very few institutions and organizations that were not eligible for PPP relief. And that's been a really big issue for some of our state and local chambers of commerce. Coming up with some sort of new definition and funding for state and local governments. This has been a growing issue. We know that state and local governments have been hit hard. That ties in with the unemployment issue. Unemployment benefits, the expanded unemployment benefits ran out at the end of the summer. And there's two issues with that. Dealing with some sort of extra relief for minimum wage and just above minimum wage workers, but also going back to state and local relief. Many unemployment trust funds have gone broke, which triggers tax increases sort of on autopilot. That's something that needs to be addressed. Dealing with money for K through 12 schools. You all have kids. I've got a kid. The world is very different for schools, whether you're back or not. Extra relief is needed for them. Sort of commensurate with that is an issue that has not received enough attention is daycare providers. Getting Americans back to work is going to require that our kids are safe, and you're not going to make $1 million running a daycare center. And where do you come up with the money for extra PPE, hand sanitizers, smaller classes, more staff, more cleaning? That's one of the issues that really hasn't been addressed very much. And then you have the issue that Matt is going to talk about in a few minutes, dealing with liability. We want to see timely, temporary, targeted liability relief for businesses that are trying to do the right thing in the pandemic. So those are a lot of the issues that remain out there that need to be addressed. And what I think is common about all of those issues is that deals could be cut on all of these issues. None of these issues are so difficult that Congress could not work their will and come up with some agreement on some of these things. Liability would be a difficult one, but it could be bridged. Dealing with PPP reauthorization might be more straightforward, certainly could be bridged. But really the biggest issue that I haven't talked about is the issue of funding. And one of the things that our senior economist at the Chamber has been talking about is that we're in a K-shaped recovery. Early in the pandemic, we were talking about what the recovery would look like. Would it be a V? The economy crashes and then comes right back up. Would it be a W, where it crashes, comes back up, crashes again, and comes back up? Would it be a check mark, where it crashes and then comes up slowly? What we found is that we're in a K-shaped recovery. There's some sectors of the economy that are doing great. If you're in home improvement, going great. If you're in appliances, going great. If you're in technology and e-commerce, fantastic. If you're in hospitality and restaurants, in the toilet. If you're in brick and mortar, in the toilet. There's two different stories in the economy that are being told, and that has made it difficult for Congress to sort of coalesce about what a size of the package should look like. On the House side, the House passed their bill way back when in the summer, and that program was another $3 or $4 trillion on top of the $3.5 trillion phase 1, 2, and 3 packages that were already out there. So it was a big, big package. The Republicans on the Senate side, generally speaking, have had difficulty coalescing around another number. They've even had difficulty coalescing around a number as small as $500 billion. So between $3 or $3.5 trillion and $500 billion, that's a pretty big divergence. And that's really been one of the areas that's made it difficult for another coronavirus package to come together. And so where are we at now? There's some who think that we don't need to do another coronavirus relief package. There's many that think that we need to do another very big coronavirus relief package. Do not expect something to happen until after the election at this point. And then where does that leave us and what do we do? I'll be honest, the answers are messy. Like I said, I'm talking to you from my messy basement. I don't think that we know. I think that we can look at, and I can't believe that I'm saying this because now I'm old, but if we look back 12 years and what sort of happened after the financial crisis of 2008 and 2009, that really sort of unfolded in just after the election and in the transition between one administration to another and one Congress to another, changing majorities. Congress had a hard time dealing with emergency relief legislation in the post-election lame duck. And then there was a huge push early in the Obama administration to deal with a second round of stimulus. So are we going to see some sort of coronavirus package come together right after the election? I think that's possible. But if there's a change at the top of the ticket, if there's a change in the majority in the Senate, if there's a change in the majority in the House, although that looks unlikely, is the opportunity there? Yes, but I think it then becomes very, very difficult in those situations. If we have a status quo election where President Trump is reelected and the Republicans hold the Senate, things perhaps become easier. But you guys are in Pennsylvania. You all know about, I'm sure that you're seeing all the ads about what it means to be a swing state. So if you guys have a clearer picture on what's going to happen in this election than I do, I'd appreciate if you could share it with me. But I don't know that we're going to know what the outcome of the election is right away, so that a clear path forward may not exist. And then sort of shifting just for a moment to the political side, in 2008, I think that we knew pretty clearly that there was going to be a change in administration, and we knew what the makeup of the House and the Senate was going to be. We may not have those answers here after this election. So the numbers on early voting and mail-in balloting have been very, very big. That is going to lead to some extra time in terms of counting those ballots, where we may not know on election night all of those totals. That could take some time. In addition to that, there's some key races that may not be decided for some time. In particular, I'm talking about Georgia. Both Senate seats are up in Georgia. And the way that that elections in Georgia work, if neither of the candidates get over 50%, which is possible in both of those two races, they would head to a runoff. So we may not know what the outlook, who the majority is going to be in the Senate until after those elections in January. So, so the issues that are confronting Congress at this point are the biggest one continues to be dealing with another round of coronavirus legislation. There's lots of other issues out there, infrastructure, some other things. We need sort of to get past the election to have a clear sense on what things are going to look like. That clear sense is not going to happen the Wednesday after Election Day, most likely. And we're going to have to continue to work together to see what all of this means in the weeks after Election Day. For the business community, we're going to have to continue to work together. We're going to have to continue to be in close contact. We're already gaming out what it looks like if the Democrats take control of the Senate, if there's a change at the top of the ticket, if there isn't, and how we're going to address and confront all of these issues. So Liz, we really appreciate the opportunity to speak today. I think that it's important that you're having this discussion now as we get ready for what's going to come in the next couple of weeks. And we look forward to continuing to be in close contact. And I'll turn it back over to you at this point.
Thank you very much. I appreciate all you've been able to share with us. And next we have Matt Webb.
Great, thanks, Liz. So as Ron mentioned, one of the major points that Congress is still debating and will be debating during their lame duck session is coronavirus stimulus relief legislation. And one of the big parts of that is liability relief for businesses, nonprofit schools, et cetera, as far as potential COVID-related liability. Throughout the various iterations and discussions on all of the stimulus packages, Senate Majority Leader McConnell has made it very clear that any phase 4 legislation related to COVID will have to have some form of liability relief contained within that legislation. To that end, Senator John Cornyn from Texas and Senator McConnell introduced standalone legislation called the Safe to Work Act that accomplishes a number of things, not the least of which is making clear that for a business to be held liable for a COVID-related exposure, a plaintiff would have to show by clear and convincing evidence that the business acted in a grossly negligent manner or otherwise engaged in willful misconduct and was not following the appropriate government guidance on how to deal with COVID. So basically, if you are doing the quote unquote right thing, it would be exceedingly difficult for a plaintiff to hold a business liable for a COVID-related exposure. In addition, the bill provides a number of medical malpractice or medical liability protections for healthcare providers and healthcare facilities with a similar standard for the broader business community. And then it also contains language to make clear that COVID-related litigation would be eligible for federal court jurisdiction, as well as making clear that the various liability provisions and protections contained in the legislation are a floor rather than a ceiling. So states could provide more protections than the federal legislation, but they couldn't go below that. In addition, contains a number of protections on the labor employment side of the ledger as well. And then finally, it makes clear that it's not intended to supplant workers' comp protections as well for COVID-related exposures experienced by workers. So where do we stand with the legislation? I mean, it has now become a sticking point in the negotiations on the overall phase 4 negotiations. I think it's fair to say that Speaker Pelosi is not particularly enamored with the liability provisions, though there are a number of folks on the moderate side, including a group called the Problem Solvers Caucus, which is a bipartisan group made up of 25 Republicans and 25 Democrats in the House that are pushing for liability protections. So she doesn't have a unified conference on this point. But long story short is that there continues to be a lot of negotiations and discussion about the liability provisions. Leader McConnell's made clear that he's not going to be advancing anything without that. But again, one of the condition predicates to actually getting to that is resolving the higher dollar issues that Ron mentioned, as far as the level of ultimate relief that the legislation or stimulus package may ultimately provide on the fiscal side before they can actually really get down to brass tacks as far as liability protections. As far as where things are going in the next Congress and the lame duck on other liability issues. One of the major points for the trial bar is that they are trying to do everything they possibly can to get rid of pre-dispute arbitration clauses. So that's something we anticipate to be a big fight, non-COVID related, moving into the 117th Congress. In addition, I think they're going to be looking for ways to do, anything they can to increase private causes of action, private rights of action. And as a result, we're looking at the 117th Congress being an exceedingly active environment for the trial bar, trying to do everything they can to increase liability for the business community. But with that, happy to take any questions. So.
All right, and at this time, I do not see any in the Q&A. Do we have any questions for Ron or Matt?
I got a question for Matt. Matt, who's trying to get a hold of you? I saw all the calls coming in. And for everybody else, I hope it's okay, because Matt is actually a first responder. So he's always on call.
Yeah, no, this was some other stuff. So I apologize for all the interruptions.
There's definitely a lot going on in your world. And so it's great to get a piece of that from you guys today. And let's see, Jocelyn, do we know if Caroline will be joining us this morning? Oh, I think you're on mute. Oh, we do have a question from Meg Mitchell, who is on our board. What keeps you guys up at night?
You know, that's a really interesting question. And there's a lot of things that keep me up at night. It's tough to deal with. You know, frankly, I think right now what keeps us up at night is the uncertainty. You know, we're a week out of the election. The chamber has a very robust political program. You know, we've been very, very engaged in a number of Senate races throughout the country, in particular, some House races too. You know, for us and for our political program, we think it's really, really important to maintain a pro-growth, pro-jobs majority in the Senate. And we've been engaged in this for, you know, months and months and months. In addition to that, for the past 2 years, we've been working really, really hard to build bipartisan relationships and work with Democrats that have been voting with us or are sympathetic to some of our issues, so that on issues like liability reform and PPP relief and economic growth and all of these other things, we can build from the center out and get some things done. You know, we can't get to 218 in the House with just Republican votes. The Democrats have the majority. So there's a lot of stuff that we've been working on for a long time. And we're, you know, just a couple of days before the election, and there's not much more that we can do. So sort of, as Tom Petty said, the waiting is the hardest part, and trying to figure out what the world is going to look like after Election Day is one of the big concerns. And then sort of what keeps me up at night is how close things are going to be. You know, are we going to have to wait until January sometime on whether the Democrats have control of the Senate or the Republicans have control of the Senate? Is it going to be 50-50? You know, I think if there's, I think the Senate is looking like whatever it is, Democrat controlled, Republican controlled, it's only going to be by a couple of votes. That's going to make legislating very, very difficult for whichever majority leader has that job. So just the sense of uncertainty sort of keeps us up. And then look, I'm sure that in all of your organizations, you've got the same thing. You've got bosses that want to know what's going to happen. And if you don't know who's going to be sitting in the Senate or sitting in the White House, it's really difficult to do all of that planning that needs to occur. And then, the whole mail-in ballot thing, I think one thing that is sometimes lost in a political debate is elections are sloppy. They're not sloppy because people are bad. They're sloppy because a lot of Americans go out to vote and we're human, and trying to make sure that that process works as well and as seamlessly as possible is a huge effort. And, mistakes will occur here and there. How are they going to be compounded or changed, or what kind of new mistakes or errors or problems are going to emerge because of coronavirus and early voting and all of these different things? We don't know. And there's a lot of other things that we don't know. So at this point, those are the kinds of things that are keeping me up at night. And I don't know if Matt has anything else to share.
No, I mean, I very much agree. The uncertainty is a challenge, and it's also a question of whether or not, no matter how the elections play out, what both parties are going to end up being able to do as far as finding a reasonable way of working with each other. Because as Ron points out, neither side is going to have a operative supermajority, particularly in the Senate. And even if the Democrats do take control of the Senate, and if they get rid of the legislative filibuster, their margins are going to be so razor thin, based on most of the projections that are out there, that including the ones that are most favorable to them, that no matter what, the moderates in both the Republican and Democratic parties, to the extent that the moderates do exist still, which there are a number who do, they're going to have a disproportionate amount of potential power in that scenario. And I think that it's going to be a challenge to see how they exercise that power moving into the 117th Congress, because there is a lot of need in the country on a lot of things that really need to be done. Obviously, not the least of which is additional relief on the COVID side of the ledger, but there are also a number of other issues, for example, infrastructure. And unless the parties are able to actually come together and work together to accomplish something, continued gridlock in Washington is not a recipe for long-term success for the country. And I mean, they're going to have to find a way to work together, and that's a large part of what the U.S. Chamber is working on, is trying to find a way to build that middle and make it something, be a functioning government, for lack of a better way of describing it. So I don't know, Ron, if you wanted to add to that or not, but.
No, I think that's a really great point.
Okay, and we had another question come up. Thank you very much for your answers to the last one. Is there any public education role that the Chamber is working on to educate a young American who hears the positive message of a socialist-minded candidate, teaching them the merits of the free enterprise system?
So yeah, that's a great question, and it's frankly one of the issues that our CEO has spent a lot of time talking about in terms of civics education and things like that. On the question of socialism and things like that, one of the other things that we've spent a lot of time over the past several years talking about has been sort of the disconnect between old people like me and younger voters. I'm 50 years old. When I got my degree in political science, it was during the Reagan era. We had the big bad Soviet Union, and sort of the discussion of what socialism was and what it represented was very, very different than what millennials and the next generation after them think about these issues. Socialism doesn't mean is not my flavor of socialism to many of the younger people. Socialism is more like social media, that kind of stuff. And also, if we look at people who are younger, what has their relationship with the economy been? The big events in their life have been the 2001 terrorist attacks and the economic and social calamity after that, the 2008-2009 financial crisis, and the COVID crisis. They've lived through some pretty extreme things in their relatively youthful experiences. And the government's response to all of those things have been challenging. So the security and the economic and social security that people from younger generations feel is different than the economic, social security that my generation and older generations have felt. And we need to continue to make the case of free enterprise, risking capital, entrepreneurship, and the benefits and the prospects that all of that all involves. So that we have been very, very engaged in that space. We've tried to do many things in that area, some big, some little, in terms of dealing with internships and things like that. And then even broadening that out a little bit. One of the things that's sort of in the post George Floyd era that we've been talking about is how to make sure that all Americans feel a sense of opportunity to participate and engage and achieve success in that, the benefits of free enterprise. So in addition to what we've done sort of on the civics side and the good government stuff, we've also been very, very engaged in the equality of opportunity space as well. So I think that's a great question. And if you'd like to get engaged with us in that, get me your contact information. We can send you some stuff.
That's great. Thank you. We have one more question at the moment. Would you guys like to answer that or toss it over to Caroline?
You want to do the one question and then toss it over to Caroline to wrap us up?
That sounds good. So what sources of media do you feel are most trustworthy?
So for me, I don't watch TV news very much. I just find it infuriating regardless of the channel. The sources of media that I consume, I read the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post every day. I also keep it real with the New York Post and the New York Daily News because I'm from New York, and I enjoy following what the New York Mets are doing and some of that other kinds of stuff. I think that Politico and Axios are two really, really good sources for sort of insidery, what's actually going on in Washington kinds of things. So I do a lot of that. I think I would be cautious for anybody who's trying to tell you what to believe on the left or on the right. I think that those sources, look, everybody's got a spin, everybody's got a spiel, but at the end of the day, I think that those sort of mainstream sources do a pretty good job of informing me as a media consumer, and those are the things that I follow the most. I use Twitter. There's some folks I follow on there. I try to not get wrapped up too much in the craziness back and forth. I do not engage on Facebook at all. And all of my crazy friends from high school and college, they can believe whatever they want. I'm not going to engage with them. If you're interested in following me, I'm at Ron at the Chamber on Twitter. I try to only post positive stuff on there, at least to the extent that I can. But that's what I consume.
And one thing I would also add to to what Ron was saying, I think one of the biggest things anyone can do as a consumer of the media is look at reporting from both sides or all possible sides, because usually where you can figure out where reality is sort of where the Venn diagram intersects between what the various outlets are saying. And because obviously if you're just getting your news from one single source, there very much can be a bias there. But if you're getting it from multiple sources from that take multiple perspectives, usually you can kind of parse out what reality actually is versus what someone wants to sell you as being reality.
And, to Matt's point, and I hate to disturb Caroline for one more second, but an example of what Matt's talking about, I took a chamber trip to Israel and Palestine 2 or 3 years ago. And, there's some very black and white kinds of issues there. When you're on the ground, there's also a lot of gray. And sort of what I took from there is to look at both sides and see what both sides are saying, because neither side is 100% correct and neither side is 100% incorrect. And sort of trying to figure out and sort the different truths that are on both sides can be extraordinarily helpful. And when I'm looking at an issue related to, what's going on in the Balkans or in the Middle East, or what's going on in Washington or in state houses, looking at sort of the differences and the commonalities really helps out a lot.
All right, thank you both very much. We have Caroline now with us to cover tax policy. So thank you for joining us, and I will turn it over to you.
Great, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. I am a native Pennsylvanian, so a state that's near and dear to me. So I'm gonna go through and I'm gonna talk a little bit about the short term, meaning what we can expect in the tax space for the rest of this Congress. And then I'm going to look a little longer term, both at what would happen with Republican control or what seems more likely, which is Democrat control. I think in the short term, and I'll try not to be duplicative with what Ron talked about. I'm sure he's talked about the potential COVID bills, obviously not occurring prior to the election since the Senate is in recess. And there's really no agreement. I think the biggest thing in the tax space there is we'd love to see additional tax relief. We'd love to see expansion of the employee retention tax credit, more paycheck protection money and expansion. And we're a little concerned about seeing a clawback of some of the relief that was given in CARES, particularly the net operating loss provisions have received there's been a lot of fodder. I jumped in at the end of the last thing. The left side says that people are abusing them and the right side says, this is the way they're intended to work. So perfect example of the media reporting there. In addition to any COVID legislation that could contain tax provisions, we have tax extenders. These are 33 provisions that expire at the end of this year and thus require congressional action to change a date so these taxes don't bounce back. 2 of them, airline excise taxes and craft brewing excise taxes, are excise taxes. So they're due every 2 weeks. So Congress does see the urgency there. Congress is a little less convinced of the urgency on some of the other provisions, with the thought being that, yeah, they expire at the end of this year, but you're not filing your 2020 taxes on January 1st. Our position is that true, but to quote President Obama, we shouldn't a recession is not the time for tax hikes of any sort. So we really don't want to see these expire. We don't want to see the administrative nightmare that occurs when we change things retroactively. So I think we'll also look to lame duck to see whether we have tax extender legislation. I think in the regulatory space, we continue to implement the Tax Reform Act from 2017, IRS Treasury guidance. We've seen a lot of guidance related to COVID legislation as well. So we saw filing and payment deadline delays. We saw the allowance of electronic signatures where we haven't seen that before. Allowance of using different forms than you would normally use to get a quick refund. So I would assume that IRS has said they will continue to work to finish out all of the 2017 tax reform regulations this year. In addition, if we were to do additional COVID relief, I would expect there to be additional IRS guidance. So longer term, I think I'll look at it from both sides. If we were to see a Republican sweep, so meaning Republicans picked up the House and held the White House and the Senate, I think the first thing you would see out of the gate would be a tax cuts 2.0. You would make some of those individual provisions from tax reform that were temporary because of the budget confines permanent. The Hill would also probably want to see a capital gains tax cut. We did not touch investment taxes in tax reform. So many Republicans feel that's ripe for some changes, for some reductions. I think you would see a second bill, probably a second tranche of legislation if the Hill got their way, making some of those other business provisions in TCJA permanent. So more favorable treatment of research and development, more favorable, interest deductibility rules, potentially an expansion of opportunity zones. I think the president has generally the same ideas, but a couple that are a little different. And to be fair, there is not a, you can't go to the Trump for President website and find a plan the way you can with Biden. So a lot of this is speculation picked up from various media sources. This keeps coming back to this, but the president's also talked about tax incentive for companies not to ship, not to manufacture overseas, to bring manufacturing back here. He's talked about reducing the corporate rate to 15%. He did this payroll tax deferral earlier this year. He's talked about making that an actual cut, a payroll tax cut. So, employees wouldn't have to pay that back come the beginning of this year, beginning of next year. I think that's probably what you would see if there were Republican control. I think if there's Democratic control, a couple of things I'll say out of the gate. Obviously, we're going to see some provisions that are not as business friendly as the Republican approach would be. If you are concerned, so people are already starting to see people who are concerned about, well, if there's a President Biden and a Democratic Senate and a Democratic House, and he comes in and wants to raise taxes, what's the effective date? So a lot of people are concerned that the effective date would be retroactive to January 1st, 2021. So what are people starting to talk about because of that? Selling a company. If you can sell your company now for a 15 or 20% capital gains rate long-term, as opposed to 2021, where under a Biden proposal, it would go to ordinary rates and still be subject to a net income tax, almost 2.5, 3 times higher rates in some instances, you might say, you got to think about that. People are starting to think about that. Well, the economy is not booming right now, but I would have a lower tax rate versus maybe if the economy recovers, the value of my business would be greater, but it would be taxed, the gain on it would be taxed at a higher rate. Same thing with the stock market. You see a lot of people talking about whether they should pull money out of the stock market right now, pay the capital gains at a lower rate, and most of the time just plow the money back in. So they only pay the higher capital gains rate on that little bit that they make after. These are just sort of some of the considerations you start to see, and I think we'll hear more about those post-election when we, fingers crossed, hopefully have a better idea of what the political makeup is. The other thing I would say, so talking more about substance of what I would expect to see, a presidential candidate Biden has said, I'm going to raise taxes day one. Look, we're in a recession. I don't think, heeding once again President Obama's advice, recession is not the time to raise taxes. I think a lot of moderate Democrats in the Senate do not view that as their first priority. They might need additional stimulus legislation that would probably contain more spending than a bill that's written by Republicans. And I think you'll see sort of a piecemeal approach more likely out of the gate. So they may try and repeal some of the TCJA provisions. I certainly would expect to see a restatement of the state and local tax deductibility. And I think there's been a lot of rhetoric surrounding taxes on the wealthy. So I think that's sort of the general themes you would see out of a Democratic control situation. longer term, so what longer term tax hikes are we looking at? On the individual side, the Biden proposal talks about increasing the marginal rate back up to 39.6, which is what it was for high income individuals and successful small businesses prior to tax reform. As I just mentioned, Biden would tax capital gains, long-term capital gains, as ordinary income, so therefore at that 39.6% rate. We also, thanks to healthcare, have a 3.8% net investment tax, so you would be north of 43% on capital gains rates for long-term. I think you could see some of the deduction limitations come back on the individual side, PEP and PEs, personal exemption, and some of the other limits on itemized deductions that higher income taxpayers see. I mentioned SALT being reinstated. I think you would see an expansion of charitable deductions or charitable incentives. The estate tax would revert to sort of pre-Bush tax cuts levels, as well as exemption amount rates and exemption amounts. On the business side, there have been a lot of discussion about raising the corporate rate from 21 to 28%, particularly in the context of what kind of spending that could pay for. There has been a discussion of minimum taxes on companies that make over $100 million on their, basically like a corporate alternative minimum tax, which we got rid of in tax reform. We would double the rate on overseas income. I think you would probably see additional renewable incentives and continue to tax on fossil fuels or traditionally extractive industries. So I think obviously very big differences here in what potentially, could happen. I think outside of that, obviously every state has their own set of tax issues as well. I believe that Pennsylvania continues to sort of look at how does Wayfair, the court case that decided how you collect online sales tax, apply to taxes other than sales taxes. I think a lot of questions at the state level too about whether tax incentives for economic development work. So, some of the conversations we have at the federal level are very similar to what you have at the state level. I will stop. I know no one wants to listen to a tax person talk for more than like 10 minutes straight. So I'm happy to take questions or, I'm happy to take a deeper dive on any of those things.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. I don't, let's see, do we have any questions for Caroline or any additional questions overall? It's a very interesting time right now, lots in flux.
Yes, definitely.
Let's see.
Do you want to move on to the next speaker? Do you want to I'm not sure when.
Well, we have the three of you joining us from the chamber, which has been fantastic. And give it a minute here and see if anybody else has anything they'd like to ask or, expectations. We covered a lot of that. The best you could. My goodness. Like I said, so many moving parts.
I'll say there's a lot of moving pieces. I will add one other thing. This idea of tax hikes and the president, President Biden would do that right out of the gate. The reality is taxes are not the priority for the Democratic Party that they are for the Republican Party traditionally. So things like infrastructure, which we're obviously very supportive of, a big priority, whether it be highway funding or energy pipelines or 5G, infrastructure for internet. I think you're going to see the priorities are a little different. I kind of took into the micro impact in the tax space, but I think there are other priorities that operate that will be important.
Oh, here we go. A question is, where would the Problem Solvers Caucus land on these issues? It may not be all Republican or Democrat control.
Yeah, I think the problem solvers obviously have been an important part of the conversation, trying to find middle ground to advance, policies that can be, to show that there do exist in Washington policies that can have bipartisan support. I think tax is probably a very challenging issue for the problem solvers. There is just such a diversion on what Republicans want and what Democrats want or think is the appropriate level of taxation, that it's very hard for me to see them come together, maybe on some sort of stimulus relief, maybe on some sort of tax relief continuing in the face of COVID. I think that's more likely than, you know, an overhaul, you know, any sort of like overhaul bill coming together on that.
Okay, thank you. All right, any other questions for Caroline, Ron, or Matt? I give you a lot of credit. Like you said, it's sometimes when you start talking about taxes, it's like you just get the, like, people get the glaze, but you did a really good job.
It could be that everyone's asleep. It could be that there are questions, but everyone fell asleep halfway through that, which, you know.
No, that was fantastic.
Well, let me say this. If they're not questions now, but you have additional questions later, please reach out to our political affairs team. You know, I certainly am sure I speak for the other chamber folks as well. You know, we're always happy to answer questions after the fact. So.
Great, and we can definitely do that and, you know, facilitate that, get them to you, or we have your information to share too. So
yep,
cool.
All
well,
right.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, absolutely. It was great to have you all today, and you all have a wonderful afternoon. And then our next session is at 11:45. So we'll talk to our attendees then. Thanks, guys.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.